Glad that you're visiting with us. If you would stop by the connection point out here in the lobby before you leave, we have a gift for you and get to know you a little bit better. If you're not ready to get to know us a little bit better yet, one-on-one in person, you can just text us or you can text me. That's my number up here on the screen. I'm happy to try to answer any questions I possibly can about the message or about the church here. We're just really glad you're here. If you're joining us online, thank you so much for joining with us today. If you want to turn in your Bibles, John chapter 17. Gospel of John 17 chapter, prayer of Jesus. He prays about his relationship with God. He prays for his followers, and he prays for all of us in that prayer. We're going to focus on the middle part of that. Before we get to that, though, a couple important announcements I need to make. Two major events of the month are coming up the next 2 Sundays. Next Sunday, David Peters of Rapha House. Rapha House is a mission that deals with trying to rescue those caught in human trafficking and trying its best to fight against human trafficking around the world. Well, he's going to be with us here next Sunday morning speaking for us during our services. But then over the lunch hour, we're going to have a special seminar. We're calling it Breaking the Silence because it's one of those subjects that's so horrific to even think about. We don't even like to think about it sometimes, let alone talk about it. But he's going to talk about not just what's going on worldwide, but what we can do here locally to try to fight human trafficking, because it's going on even in our own community. And so that's next Sunday. If you could do me a favor, if you're going to come to that, which I really hope you do, lunch is going to be catered, and it's going to run from 12:30 to 2 o'clock. So it's not going to take the whole afternoon, just going to be while we're eating, he's going to be presenting this seminar. We have a couple other churches joining us, but if you would do me a favor and register for that, you can do that on Facebook, on the church's page there. If that's too difficult or you don't want to do that, if you just want to stop by Connection Point and let us know that you're going to be there, that would really be helpful so we know the right number of people to order for, right? So that's going to help us out. So that's next Sunday. I just think it's going to be a really important week. The Sunday after that, the 19th, we're going to have Family Dedication Sunday. Family dedication. A lot of little people have been added to different families this past year. We thank God for that. But it's not just a blessing for them, it's a blessing for the whole church. And it's a responsibility for the whole church, right? And so we're going to have a special focus on that. Family Dedication Sunday, the 19th, for those who have had babies and those who are going to any day now have a baby. And we have them in both services. And it's, wow, what a blessing. And by the way, I've got to add this too. Even though there's a special meaning for people who are members here at the church, this is for everybody. So if you work with somebody or you know somebody else that's recently had a little one or they're going to, great opportunity. Invite them to church here because we're going to have a special prayer time and a special service for them on the 19th. And I just hope and pray God will use that in a lot of different ways, not just blessing the families who have these little people, but us all. Okay, so those events are coming up. Let's get into the Gospel of John, but let's take just a minute and pray and ask God's blessing on our time before we get into his word, okay? Would you bow with me just out of respect, remembering who we're talking to, the Lord God Almighty. Gracious Heavenly Father, what a privilege it is to call you our Father because we have a relationship with you. We've been adopted into your family. We are loved by you, the one who is the Almighty, who spoke everything into existence. And with awe, we think about our relationship and the love that you have towards us. But God, we also just think with awe how great you are. And I'm reminded of this because when we turn to your word is not like any other word that we're ever going to read. It's your word, and it accomplishes exactly what you intend for it to accomplish. God, I just pray that you would help us understand your word, that you would grant us that wisdom. You would also grant us the boldness that it takes to take what we understand your will to be and discernment to apply it to everyday life, but to actually live it out. God, because we really desire to represent you well, like a light in a dark world. God, please bless us as your people as we try to represent you, and even today, as we look to your word, to better equip us for the job that you've got for us to do. That's my prayer in Jesus' name. Gospel of John, the 17th chapter. We're going to get there in just a minute. I want to tell you about actually a guy I knew very little about until I was visiting my brother up in Indianapolis. and he was pointing out to me, we drove past this huge church building. A preacher's name there is a guy by the name of John, and during the discussion, he was telling me a little bit about John, and I found out a little bit more. I bought a book as a result of talking to my brother. And John, his name's John Dickerson, for much of his adult life was a award-winning journalist. He was an investigative reporter. I mean, he wrote articles for different news agencies cross country. I mean, this guy was tops in his field, right? But for much of his adult life, he would describe himself as a skeptic in matters of faith, especially Christianity, a non-believer. Now he's a preacher of Connection Point Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. So I'm like, during this discussion, okay, how do we get from here to here, right? Well, he wrote this book. It's called Jesus Skeptic. And in this book, he kind of describes a lot of the factors that got him from non-believer, from skeptic to somebody who's not only a believer, he's all in and wants everybody, right, to be a believer. Well, reading this book, a lot of people's stories, they have common threads, right? There's certain arguments or certain lines of thought that get them from point A to B. This guy does not think like I think. So I'm all over this. Let me tell you just, I'll try to be quick, but let me tell you this guy's story. It all started in Monterey Bay, California, just south of San Francisco. Monterey Bay, have anybody been to Monterey Bay? Have you seen the sea otters there? Okay, Monterey Bay, one of the things that they're famous for is the sea otters. See, a raft, had to look this one up on Google. You don't call them a pod, you don't call them a flock, you call them a raft. And I'm guessing one of the reasons you call them a raft is, sea otters don't live, right? They play, right? That's what sea otters do, they play. But when it's time, they play so hard, when it's time for them to rest, they kind of take a nap on their back and they float, but they hold hands. They're not paws, they hold paws, whatever. They hook up with one another so that they don't drift apart, right? And all the little ones they put on their tummies, right? So they call them a raft, right? Okay, I digress. We've got all these sea otters in Monterey Bay. What in the world does this have to do with Christianity? Okay, here you go. Evidently, maybe because investigative reporter, I don't know, maybe just because he lives in that region, but he knows a lot about sea otters. You see, back in the 1920s, when the sea otter population was almost totally wiped out, Monterey Bay went down the tubes. They didn't just lose the sea otters, they lost all sorts of marine life, and it was devastating to the bay. It wasn't until the 1970s that they discovered that the sea otters were not just one of the species that inhabited Monterey Bay, but they were, here's what the scientists call them, a keystone species. Well, what's a keystone species? Well, here's the way I look at it. Have you ever played the game Jenga? You know how that goes? You got this stack of little blocks, right? You're supposed to pull a block out without a fall. It gets to the point where there's no way. Certain blocks, you pull them out and the whole thing's coming down, right? Well, if you think that way, that's what a keystone species is. You take this species out of the ecosystem right there, the whole ecosystem crumbles. Why? Again, I don't want to get sidetracked, but if you take the sea otter out of the bay, the sea otter is the only creature in the marine life there that eats the sea urchin. Why is that important? Because if you don't keep in check the sea urchin eats the kelp. The kelp is part of the major ingredient of the undersea forest that supplies all the marine life with life there. So the sea urchin ruins the kelp because there are no sea otters there. I'm getting lost. But anyway, the sea otters keep the sea urchins, and then the underground forest, and then all the marine life. You take them out, you've taken the keystone species out, and everything dies off. When they reintroduced sea otter, now the orcas come back, now all sorts of marine life. Now it's great because you've got keystone species. What in the world does this have to do with John Dickerson becoming a Christian? He's driving down the road, driving past a hospital, Presbyterian hospital. And he thinks to himself, Presbyterian hospital. Makes me think of the Methodist hospital, makes me think of the Baptist hospital, makes me think of the Christian hospital. In the back of the mind, he's thinking sea otters, keystone species. And he cites the sources in his book, but he says, you know what? I got to thinking, evidently because of a lot of his research as a reporter, he was looking into different major hospitals across the country. And he said the 10 major hospitals, and I don't know how they judge these things, but in 2018, 2019, the 10 greatest, quote unquote, hospitals in the United States, 9 of them were either started by churches or Christian organizations. So he, knowing that, thinking about sea otters, thinking about keystone species, he starts thinking to himself, what impact has Christianity had on healthcare in the United States? In other words, think about it this way. If there were no Christians, what would be the state of healthcare in the United States today? I'm telling you, you might think of having an impact as some sort of impact. This guy, from his perspective, doing his research, said it would have been devastating, the impact if you take Christianity out of the mix. In fact, he goes from looking at hospitals to looking at women's rights and the way different cultures and different groups across the globe through history have treated women. And he says, you know what? You take Christianity out of the mix, you know where women would be today? I don't know how much you know about this, but he chronicles a lot of this in his book, and case after case, point after point, event after event, he looks at the impact that Christianity has had. And you know what? As a skeptic, he got to the point where he said, you know what? Christianity is the keystone thing in the history of our world. If you take Christianity and you take Christ out of the mix, we would not have life the way we have life today, at least not a good life. That's part of the reason that he becomes Christian. Now, I realize bringing up this whole subject, there's a lot of things that I cannot cover, but I also know that a lot of people, when they hear something like this, they're going to say, oh, yeah. I know there's a lot of good that Christians have done, but Christians have done a lot of bad things too. I got two things to say about that. Number one, the impact that Christianity has had on the world in a negative sense, some of the bad things that have happened, I would challenge you to really do your research, because a lot of that has been blown out of proportion and misrepresented. That's number one. Having said that, I realize there are some historical events that are directly tied to the church, to Christianity, that have been bad. I realize that, fully admit that. But I think it's very important to point out, we're talking about the impact that Christianity has had that is consistent with the message of Christianity. Do you understand what I'm saying? There have been a lot of people that have done a lot of things in the name of Christ or in the name of Christianity that do not fairly represent Christianity. Does that make sense? Okay, real quick aside here, there's a guy by the name of Tom Wright. For years, he was the chaplain at Oxford University, and there were a lot of people that he met while he was at Oxford who were not believers. And he said time and time again, people would come up to him and say, I don't believe in your God. I don't believe in God. And Tom got to the point where his number one response, when somebody would say, I don't believe in God, his number one response is, which God are you talking about? Which God don't you? And usually that would catch people off guard. Well, God. I just don't believe in God. And so Tom would say, well, describe this God for me. And so if people were willing to, they would start describing the God, the God you worship, the God of the Bible, this God, and they'd start describing him. And Tom would say, that's not the God of the Bible, and I don't believe in that God either. Do you understand what he was saying? Which I thought was such an effective point, because so many people misrepresent it. That's one of the reasons we spend so much time going back to the book. We don't want to misrepresent him because, get this, fairly represented, we will have, as history vindicates, Christians always have had, the greatest impact on this world if we live it consistently. In fact, this very passage points out 4 great blessings, if you will, 4 ways that Christianity has made our world a better place. Here they are, all in Jesus' prayer. He says, because we bring this world truth, we bring this world joy, we bring this world goodness, and we bring this world unity. Don't have time to cover all 4. I've given you scriptures for the last 2. I just want us to focus on this first 2. Okay, let's look at this. John chapter 17. John chapter 17, in the middle of Jesus' prayer. I want to start here in verse 18 because it kind of gives us the context. John chapter 17, verse 18, it says, he's praying to the Father, right? And he says, as you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. Summary statement here. Let me just summarize it this way. Jesus is saying, you know what? You're my followers. You're on a mission. Right? Jesus came to have an impact on the world. We're a follower of his. We're supposed to have an impact too. As Jesus was sent to the world, so we are to be sent. On that mission, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? Well, there are 4 things that Jesus is really emphasizing in this prayer. Go back to verse 17. He says, sanctify. What does the word sanctify mean? Make holy. What does make holy, sanctify? It's a word that means be set apart, be different from everybody else, be different in a good way. In other words, if you're gonna wear the name of Christ, which I hope you're proud to wear that name, but wear it the way He wants you to wear it. Don't be like everybody else. Be a good, positive difference in this world, right? And that's what He's describing here. He wants us to be different in a good way. Sanctify them. Make them different by the truth. Your word is truth. That's why it's so appropriate every time we get together, almost every time. Even in our discipleship groups, our Bible studies Sunday morning, we're constantly opening up the Bible. Why? Because we have to come back to the standard, right? This is what we're supposed to represent, not our concept of it, but what God says. Okay, I realize talking about this subject of truth, it's not going to set well with a whole lot of people. I get that. And I'm guessing because every time you talk about truth, some people, all they hear you say is, well, you're right and I'm wrong. You know, it's one of these things that instead of it being a good, positive thing, people look at it in a negative sense. You know, the classic illustration of this, I mean, you can tell it in several different ways, but if you had some terrible sickness that made you so sick, you know, it was just miserable to be alive, and you felt like you were going to die, and you go to your doctor, and your doctor says, you're going to die, right? Unless I treat you a certain way, and he gives you that treatment, and then you're all better, and the pain's all gone, and you've got a friend or somebody else that gets the same illness. What kind of friend or jerk would you be not to share that with your friend? Do you understand what I'm saying? Listen, please hear me. The Bible talks a lot about truth, but the Bible never presents truth as something you beat people up with. Ephesians chapter 4, it says, we speak the truth in love. Thank you very much. Speak the truth. Why? Because it's one of the best things we can do for people to tell them about the cure. Okay. I want to back up and hit this from a different angle because it's not that easy. It's not that easy, and I get that. This guy named Glenn Scrivener, in one of his books, uses this political illustration. Picture this. Let's say we've got a room, and there's a bunch of different representatives of different political views. Let's say we've got a monarchist over here, a socialist in that corner, a communist over there. We've got somebody representing democracy, somebody else representing fascism, all sorts of different political ways to govern people, right? And so they're in this active debate, and things are kind of getting out of hand. They're shouting and yelling at each other because they're not swaying other people to their position. They're just defending, no, this is why we need a good monarchy, you know, and this other person, right? So they're having this active debate. Nobody's changing anybody else's mind. And a young anarchist, anarchy means no government, right? Let's just get rid of it all, right? A young anarchist comes in and he sees everybody arguing, right? And so he interrupts the argument, and he says, obviously, you guys aren't going to change anybody else's mind. Nobody agrees with anybody else. And since you think everybody else is wrong, why don't you just take one more step and join me? And we can all be anarchists. I've got your answer, right? Everybody in the room breaks out laughing. People outside the room still don't quite get it. But everybody in the room breaks out laughing. Why? Because they realize that to be an anarchist is simply another view of government, just like every other view of government that's represented in the room. Think with me. Anybody who tells you or implies that there's no such thing as absolute truth, they believe that's true. Or more pertinent, let me put it this way, because this is where the rubber hits the road with us. Anytime somebody tries to convince you that it's not a nice thing to change people, just leave them alone. Stop trying to convert the world. Stop trying to convert other people. Do you realize that they're trying to convert you into a person that doesn't convert people? Right? Are you following me here? All I'm trying to say is this truth business is something you cannot get away from. Everybody operates on this scale somewhere. All we are saying as Christians is this: we have found the source to ultimate truth from God. And what kind of people would we be not to share it with everybody else? Right? It's not something we beat people up with. It's something we set people free with. So don't ever shy away from the truth. It's what our world needs. Spent way too much time on that. Let's go to the second point. Here you go. We not only make a better difference in this world with the truth that everybody needs, we make a better difference in this world with joy that everybody wants. I've not met a person yet who said, 2020, here it is. Not going to be so happy. Just don't want to be as happy this year. Don't know anybody looking for a lower degree of happiness. Do you? Right? Everybody's looking for a little bit more fulfillment, right? A little more happiness. Well, look at what Jesus says about that. Again, this is in the context of our mission to represent him in the world. Look what he says in verse 13. I'm coming to you now. He's praying to God, right? He's almost done here with his earthly ministry, and he's saying, he's going to go to the cross, and then after that, 40 days later, the ascension. So he says, I'm coming to you now, but I say these things while I am still in the world, so that they, talking about his followers, so that they may have the full measure of my joy within them. Listen, I know good and well there's different degrees of joy in different things in life and different pursuits, right? Jesus, the one who made us, God the Father, the one who made us in his relationship with him, says, listen, if you want to find the 100%, you want to find the full measure, I got it. It's in your mission. Let me try to unpack this. Over in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, the second verse, it talks about Jesus going to the cross. You know what it says in the second verse of Hebrews chapter 12? It says he went to the cross. He went to the cross for us because of the joy set before him. Jesus saw that going to the cross is what's going to accomplish joy. How does that happen? Hang in there with me for just a minute. I don't know a simple way to say this. I'm going to come at it a couple different ways. We start our mission. How do we start our mission? Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. We usually refer to it as the Great Commission, right? Jesus said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given unto me. That word authority means he's the expert. You want to know somebody who's got life all figured out? And the life after this life, Jesus is your man, right? You got questions, he's got answers. All authority in heaven and earth has been given unto me. Therefore, in other words, based on the fact, I know how life's supposed to be lived. I know how it works, right? Therefore, go into all nations. Doing what? Making disciples. What does it mean to make disciples? Take people wherever they are, bring them closer to Jesus. That's our mission, right? Make disciples. How do you do that? You go, you make disciples by baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe everything I've commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. That's the way the verse finishes out. What's he talking about here? He says it's our job, it's our mission to do what? Get people closer to Jesus. Where does that start? Where does that start? It starts with a baptism. What is a baptism? A baptism's a burial. Have you thought about this? You want to find fulfillment, and you want to get right with Jesus, is start by burying yourself. Here's the way Jesus says it in Luke, the 9th chapter. He says, if anybody would be my follower, he must take up his what? Cross. What do you use a cross for? It's where people die. He says, you want to be my follower? There's a death. There's a burial that has to take place. Why? Because there's this basic principle of life. Here's the way Jesus says it. Anybody who's looking to try to save their life, they're going to lose it. The people who've given up their life for me, they're the ones who find it. You never find ultimate fulfillment, the kind he's talking about, by looking for it. You got to give it up and look at your mission, and then you find the fulfillment that you buried when you became a Christian. Does this make sense? Let me give you an example that maybe, hopefully, will skim the surface here. There's a missionary that I have greatly appreciated. I followed him through the years. For a time, he was in Tibet. While in Tibet, he worked with a lot of Buddhists. I don't know what you think about when you think of Buddhism, but most people, when they think of Buddhism here in the United States, it's not at all the kind of Buddhism that's represented in most of the Asian world, especially in Tibet. Buddhism and ardent followers of Buddhist philosophy. I don't know of a polite way to say this. It's a miserable existence. We so flippantly in this country talk about karma. Karma to a real Buddhist in the Asian world is a terrible thing. You know why? Because it's all about all the bad stuff that happens to you. Why is that bad stuff that happened to you? Because you made a God upset. You know why there's worship of God in this particular kind of, which, by the way, millions of people adhere to this kind of Buddhism. You know why there's a worship of God? Because you're trying to appease them. You're trying to make sure you don't get them upset. Why? Because karma. Your life's going to get all messed up unless you make them happy. So in Tibet, frequently they'll call in the Buddhist monks and I think they call them lamas and all. They've got different religious people that they bring in at the beginning of the year. How do they celebrate New Year's? They give a lot of offerings and have a lot of religious ceremonies to appease the gods so life won't be so bad. Well, there's two women he was talking about associated with the mission that he found out. This happens all the time, by the way. But there were two women in particular. Life was just not good. They gave their offerings. They did everything that the monks told them to do, and life was still bad. What do we have to do to appease the gods? We must have really upset one of them somewhere along the line because life's not good. So here's what they were told. You need to travel to such and such a mountain. You need to travel there by foot. It will take you 3.5 months to walk there. Once you get there at the base of the mountain, it's 11 miles around. And you have to get on your hands and knees and crawl around the base of the mountain until you've made the gods happy. Then your life will be good again. Listen, I could give you dozens of examples. Missionaries hear of stuff like that all the time. I'm just telling you. I mean, that's a more extreme example, but people are in bondage without Jesus, and a lot of times they don't even know it. There are people that you know and that I know that are just trying so hard to be good enough, to be right with God, and yet they go to bed at night beating themselves up because they know they're not good enough. We represent a God who so loved the world that he sacrificed his own son. We've got a message that sets the world free, that brings them joy. And you know where we find joy? In helping other people find joy. It's the greatest impact for good that the world has ever seen. One last thought. I was watching, long backstory here, I don't want to get sidetracked, but I was watching an old movie this past week called Gettysburg. Yeah, it's based on the famous battle during the Civil War. I don't know if you remember that movie, but in that movie, they represent a argument, an encounter between General Lee and General Stuart. And if you look at some of the historical background of the Civil War, you realize that Stuart created a lot of problems for General Lee during the Civil War. Anyway, here's the way they represented it in the movie. Lee, the lead general, confronts General Stuart, tells him that he's messed up. You know, no doubt he's trying hard, but he messed up. And in so telling him that he messed up, he said, "Several of your officers are losing confidence in you." And when Stuart hears that, his first response is, "Well, tell me who they are. I think I have a right to defend myself." And while he's saying that, Lee cuts him off. And Lee yells at him. He says, "Don't you realize we don't have time for this? I don't have time to tell you these names. I don't have time for you to react this way. Don't you realize what's going on?" And Lee just wants to address it so they can get back on track. He keeps the conversation short. But before the conversation's over, General Stewart takes his hat off, takes his sword out, lays it on the desk. He's resigning his position. And he starts to say, since you no longer have confidence in me, he's willing to resign. And at that, Lee stops him again. And this time he slams his fist on the desk and he says, we don't have time for this. Don't you understand? It's not about you. It's not about the way you feel. It's not about what's happened. It's not about your position. Don't you realize every minute that we're here right now, people are dying? You know, the very point that he was trying to make him during an earthly battle is a point that I think to myself, don't we realize that across the globe there's a spiritual battle going on? And even today, while we meet, people are facing an eternity without hope. When they could have joy unspeakable. There's no time to focus just on me, just on us. We've got a mission, and it's true, and it changes our world. And it's time to get to it.